Okay, so I was looking excitedly over the schedule of workshops and talks today, and I was thinking about the conversation we've been engaging in this year, right? We're in this ongoing conversation about race and empire, particularly hidden empires. We began our conversation with Daniel Immerwahr's book, How to Hide an Empire. And using Immerwahr's discussion of the logo map, we rethought a map, which we often think of as fixed and immutable, and engaged in a much broader rethinking of the cultures of empire and settler colonialism. As I look over the exciting talks and workshops for today, I'm struck by the ways in which all of our guest speakers are providing more tools for how we think about the past and its relationship to the present. When reflecting upon our understanding of larger political transformations, historians often immerse themselves in the archives. Yet Orasami Burden, a Hampshire alum and anthropologist of the archives of the carceral state, reminds us that the scope of the archives can be enhanced by the relationships we build. Today's speakers help us to understand how our understanding of the official archives, often created by states and institutions, their maps, correspondence, land deeds, can be expanded to include collective memory, songs, dance, and oral histories often rooted in family and community, sometimes practiced in cherished rituals, celebrations, and commemorations. Today, as you listen to our speakers, please listen actively and reflect on how we position ourselves in a particular relationship to the past, and how that positionality can shape our approach to building relationships in the present. And now Javiera Benavente will introduce the Common Good Residency.
Thank you so much, Amy, for giving us an overview of today and what we've been working on together this year. My name is Javiera Benavente, and I am the Director of Collaborative Learning and Practice. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm here to share a little bit about the Common Good Residency, which this talk this morning is a part of a semester-long residency that we're doing called Living Land Acknowledgements, Reciprocity, Right Relations, and Rematriation. The annual Common Good Practitioner Scholar Residency supports collaborative learning and ethical engagement across critical issues facing our communities and our times. This residency was established by the Ethics in the Common Good Project, a grant-funded project that was dedicated to cultivating collaborative and ethical leaders who were reflectively engaged in creating a more just and resilient world. And while ECG no longer exists as a project, its legacy and work continues through the residency and now as a part of the community commons. This year's residency invites the Hampshire College community to actively engage with and reflect on the question, how can we, individually, collectively, and institutionally, cultivate a right and reciprocal relationship with this land that we live and work on, and with the Indigenous peoples of this land? Through a series of engaged conversations and dialogues with Indigenous scholars and practitioners, we will craft embodied land acknowledgements, form a deeper analysis of rematriation, and build a sustainable foundation for meeting short-term and long-term goals. This residency is being organized by a collective of Hampshire students, faculty, staff, and administrators who are committed to fostering a collective community engagement and learning around these issues that can be sustained over time. And as I said, this is part of a series, and it's going to be followed on Monday, March 5th at 5 p.m. with a lecture by Dr. Marge Bruchak called Restorative Indigenous Research in Quinnipiac, the Connecticut River Valley. So I just urge all of you to check out the flyers about the residency and come out again on Monday for that really, really interesting and important talk. I also just want to say this residency is being sponsored and organized by a host of people. Many people have been involved in making this happen. The Community Commons, Community Advocacy, the Injustice and Environments and Change Learning Collaboratives, Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, the Spring 2021 We Make Community by Hands class, and also has been supported by the 5 College, Native American Indigenous Studies program, not directly in terms of funding, but indirectly because it supports this work, and many of us have been connected to that community. So I just want to encourage folks, if you're interested in finding out more about Native American and Indigenous Studies in the 5 colleges, there's brochures outside and you can pick one of these up. I also want to thank Media Services, the Housing Office, the Dean of Faculty's Office, all who have helped make this possible in really concrete ways. So just really appreciate that. And with that, I turn it over to Fiona and Isabella.
Hi, I'm Isabella. I'm a Div 3 student. I use they, she pronouns. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Fiona. I'm a Div 3 student, and I also use, I use she and her pronouns.
We want to start by sharing our intentions. This is an invitation to think actively, critically, and with deep curiosity about decolonization work. How can we collectively engage in relationship building and fulfill our responsibilities as stewards and/or guests on this land? We want to name that we are on Nonotuck land in the middle of the Quinnipiac River Valley. We would also like to acknowledge our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and Wampanoag to the east, the Mohican and Pequot to the south, the Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki and Pecumtuck to the north. In the 17th century, the Nonotuck peoples responded to ongoing colonial violence, including the spread of disease, by seeking safety with their kinship connections in surrounding areas.
In particular, the Pecumtuck's aid was vital to the survival of Nonotuck families. Native peoples maintain connections with the lands in this area, and the valley continues to be a gathering place for Native peoples, scholars, and organizers. This land acknowledgement is a collaboration of words, compiled by Bixie Estler, AC 20, and Ian Miller, AC 19 for Manuela Peak's class, Indigenous Women in World Politics. Also from the UMass Land Acknowledgement, from the Amherst College Land Acknowledgement, and with gratitude to many teachers, including those in the room. We hope that this is ongoing work. We ask that this is an ongoing engagement that we collectively and individually think about every single day. As a community, what are our relationships and responsibilities to the land that Hampshire currently occupies? We hope that you will leave today with a commitment to engage the world with curiosity. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming out today. I hesitated for a moment because I didn't know if someone was going to introduce the introducer. This morning, I would love to welcome Jean-Luc Pierite. He's a friend. He's a citizen of the Tunica-Biloxi Tribe of Louisiana, an Indigenous activist, designer, and despite his modesty, a leader with multiple areas of focus, including supporting distributed networks for education, public policy advocacy for racial, economic, and climate justice, and supporting philanthropic foundations committed to diversity and inclusion. Jean-Luc serves as president of the North American Indian Center of Boston, NAICOB, and has done so since 2017. Based on a over 50-year organizational history, Jean-Luc carries forward NAICOB's values in fundraising and liaisoning with community organizations and government agencies. He also serves on Black Mass, Coalition Executive Committee, in which he advocates for racial and economic justice through targets for public and private sectors. Jean-Luc also serves on the Community Advisory Group for the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, supporting K-12 students and BIPOC-led organizations. Previously, Jean-Luc worked as a logistics and procurement manager for the Fab Foundation, in which he managed inventories of community-based digital fabrication labs for distributed educational programming. Jean-Luc has been awarded with the inaugural LaDonna Brave Bull Allard Service Science Activist Award in the Global Community Bio Summit, which is hosted by the Community Biotechnology Initiative at the MIT Media Lab. He is also part of the Global Community BioFellows 3.0 to grow the movement of grassroots life sciences and research, and participates in the BIPOC Makers Collective as supported by Nation of Makers. Jean-Luc previously served as co-convener for the Institute for Collaborative Language Research, COLANG, which fosters relationships between academics and community language activists. Jean-Luc has earned a master's degree in design from in design from Emergent Futures from a Catalonian university in Barcelona. I can't pronounce the name of the institution, sorry. He also earned a Bachelor of Arts in Humanities with a co-major in Mass Communication and Japanese from Dillard University in New Orleans. Prior to that, he earned an Associates of Science in Video Game Design from Full Sail in Orlando, Florida. So I could say a lot more, but that would cut deep into our time. So without further ado, Jean-Luc.
It reads one way when you write it out. It sounds a whole different way when a family friend presents that to folks. Let me log onto my computer here. Thank you to the committee. Thank you to Javiera, Amy, Isabella, Fiona, Robert, Will, all the people that are here today. Thank you all for welcoming me into your space. My introduction to Hampshire College formally was accompanied by the screening of Unmaking of a College, which was a hell of a orientation, I can tell you that. I'm gonna put my timer on here so I don't have to. So this is North American Indian Center of Boston. We are, as Robert said, Massachusetts' oldest urban Indian center, providing cultural and social services for the New England Native American community for over 50 years. On my left, right, is my board vice president in the T-shirt that says braids, tobacco, moccasins, and ribbon skirts. That's Mia Johnson. She's Apache. To her side, you see Raquel Halsey of the Mandan Hidatsa Rikara. She's my executive director. In the center, we have Representative Ayanna Presley. I'm standing to the side of Representative Presley, and then to my side is our Employment and Training Director, Ella Jake Blackowl, who's Pawnee. And then off on the side there is Reggie Alkevich, who is Inuk and Haitian and our Civic Engagement Coordinator. I've been opening up with this picture of our team because of how much it means to me. And also, like, when we're talking about land, and we're talking about mapping, we're talking about spaces, I also want to just kind of talk about the story that this image provides. We're standing at the Heath Street Station, which the MBTA, the transit authority around Boston, was actually going to cut back the Green Line to two stops back. And in doing that, what they were going to tell to the people who come to this area is just get off the train and get on the bus. Not only is the Heath Street Station right by North American Indian Center of Boston, We are next door to a cancer center. We are across the street from the VA. Down the street from us is public housing. And so MBTA was going to tell us to just get on the bus and go down to where you need to go for your services. We worked with city government. We worked with our representative to do this speak out and demanded that the MBTA do not make this austerity cut, and we prevailed. And so that's what we bring to our work, not just for the New England Native American community, but for all of our neighbors, all of our peoples that are within our community today. Where I am in Jamaica Plain, where I live and where I work with North American Indian Center of Boston, we recognize that as the traditional indigenous territory of the Massachusetts Nation, who continue to this day, in part through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. In our own practice of doing land acknowledgements, we are making agreements with our hosts. This is not just pretty words that you come up and you say in the middle of a public action or just doing the theatrics. We're actually making commitments, and one of those commitments is to support every effort by our host tribes to rematriate land and natural resources back to the original peoples. I composed this vision board in an exercise led by Gadakana and Shelburne Farms. They actually brought in a little bit more of the consciousness of what it means to do land acknowledgements. And in that sense, it was going a step beyond sort of the political diplomatic sense of like, yes, we're doing this very big agreement, but then also, what does it mean for our own connection with the land? Not just the indigenous peoples, but all of the different social actors, all of our four-legged relatives, all of our winged relatives, all the waters and the plants, everything, the air. And so I was called to reflect on my own practice at the start of the pandemic. I would go out to Jamaica Pond, which you see 3 pictures of here at the bottom of the slide. On the one on the left hand, well, my left. This is left, right? Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. So on the left-hand side in the corner here, you see where the swans are starting to return back to the pond. In the center here, you can't really tell it. You have to kind of be up close to the photograph, but that's actually a metalwork sculpture of a woman with her hair braided and her belly was full. She was a pregnant woman, but it was a metalwork sort of like braided sculpture in its own self, which then became part of my stops going into the pond and reconnecting and thinking about like who was there before me. So this was like one of my points of reflection. And then off on the right-hand side is this Francis Parkman Memorial. Now, who Francis Parkman is and why he has a very big memorial is something that I don't really care to go into too much. But what was always striking to me was that there was a figure with a headdress and in robes, and he would always be looking over the pond. And so I would I would visit this memorial, and I would say, okay, well, I'm not going to worry too much about you, Francis Parkman, but this is the guy that I want to connect to. So I started to think about like, well, who could this be? I started to look into local history, and the people that were actually composing that were saying, well, this is a relief depiction of a forest Indian. And I thought, how many times with all of these different monuments do we as Black and Indigenous people show up as composites? How many times do we have to go up to these images and think about who that could be, or who that could be cobbled to be. And so I just was applying my own values, my own identity, and forming relationship with the statue, because for me it was something that, yes, I should have this as part of my practice, but at the same time, like, it means for me to have my own values applied, my own perspective applied, just to give this person an identity. And as you see, other people came here in the summer of 2020 and applied their own values to this memorial. ACAB, land back, and slogans in solidarity with Palestine. So that's summer of 2020. But what about today? Currently, we're all processing the situation in the Ukraine. And for whatever Putin's ambitions are, and of course, we just hope for the preservation of life, but also, it's a very complicated situation. But what's not complicated is that there is nuclear power infrastructure that is there. And there is a concern that if there is some bombing or something that happens, ecological destruction, nuclear pollution will go all across the European continent. Not only that, but Ukraine, as positioned as the breadbasket of Europe, produces corn and wheat. And so anything that happens there impacts the food security of the Middle East and Africa. And so we have to think about all of these different things when we come from these contexts. We have to think about what's happened here in the United States. Just last month, President Jonathan Nez of Navajo Nation marked the National Day of Remembrance for Downwinders. And in that remembrance, he remarked on the sacrifices that Navajo Nation has made for the United States. Not only did Navajo Nation contribute to the code talkers in World War II, those veterans that we constantly see, but generations of Dene have sacrificed much in the way of the federal government's pursuit of nuclear power. The devastation due to uranium mining that's happened on Navajo lands has led to impacts on the collective emotional and spiritual health of President Nez's people. But we can go even more locally. Here is Herring Pond Wampanoag chairperson Melissa Harding Ferretti speaking in protest of plans for the Pilgrim nuclear power plant, which was decommissioned. The wastewater coming from that plant is proposed to be dumped in Cape Cod Bay. And so Chairwoman Ferretti has to stand there and make her demands be known. But before that, she has to thank the ancestors, the creators, the earth, the sky, the rivers, the waters, land, and all the creatures. Because it's not just people today that are impacted by these decisions that happen to the land. And although Chairwoman Ferretti grew up with this, they've learned to normalize having a nuclear power plant within their own land, but be ever vigilant about any impacts. So I think about all that stuff, and I think about a meme that some of y'all may have heard of, in that for the planet today, around 80% of the Earth's biodiversity is stewarded on nearly 24% of the Earth's land surface, stewarded by almost 5% of the Earth's population who identify as indigenous peoples. And I think about that meme, and I think about value systems. I think about how, here in the United States, we're often told that we're disproportionately impacted by poverty, by drug addiction, by everything that can keep us down. And yet, indigenous peoples are safeguarding 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. And so what does it mean to invert value systems for our people and for all of us? On the left-hand side, you see a medal from a king of Spain. You see a historic blurb here. Where my tribe was positioned along the Mississippi River, we often were making agreements, and those agreements came with medals. The medals would come from Spain. We would go and take those Spanish medals and then show them to the French and say, hey, could you cut us a better deal? Or go to England or whoever. And over time, we participated in this top-down exchange of values. Here, more locally again, we have an example of the wampum belts, processed from quahog shells. The picture that you see on the right is a picture of Wampanoag, Mashpee Wampanoag artisan Hartman Dietz, who came to North American Indian Center with an idea for a project. He was going to teach community members how to process quahog shells into each of these individually these beads, using today's tools. And after the beads were processed, then they were going to be put into this designed belt. Now, this belt is actually encoded the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This belt was then, after it was made, then taken down to the Southwest, where Hartman's partner, Michelle Cook, was able to teach a law school class from this belt. And so I think about the community coming together, as it had done for generations, to each individually come up and process a piece of this wampum belt, and then have that in turn be an encoding of an international agreement. So we have top-down value systems versus grassroots value systems. Both participated from indigenous peoples, but different examples of how we invert value systems. And then reflecting even more on quahog shells, we have the example of the shell middens that are along New England's coast that are currently endangered by coastal erosion and rising sea levels. I found this quote by Bonnie Newsom, who is a citizen of Penobscot Nation. We have to remember that social values and philosophies on property, territory, and ownership vary from society to society. Understanding those values within the context of indigenous worldviews and social structures will aid in our interpretations of middens as monuments. Now, these middens were constructed from food waste. People would eat the quahog shells and then have these mounds be built up. But these are as Newsom is saying, monuments. These are markers of resources of land. There was another quote that I found of Newsom's in which she said that for Wabanaki peoples, the housing structures, bark would be taken and then brought into another community to build more houses, but the structures themselves would remain so others could come in and have housing. And so these shell middens that are now endangered, they are evidence of cultures that go back for millennia. There are remnants of burial sites, of villages that are embedded in these middens. Upcycled food waste and endangered by coastal erosion and rising sea levels. But that quahog use to store thousands of years of data into shell middens, or to process the beads and have them an encoding of international treaties, thinking about indigenous technologies. We've had computers for a very long time. It might not be things that we plug into the wall, but indigenous peoples have had this down for quite a while. And also, we have some of our other waste material. We have these Chicago Blackhawks jerseys. The Chamorro Kosari architect, Santiago X, took these jerseys, yes, as waste material, but his whole work is centering around revitalizing indigenous architecture. And so we take, once again, we're taking waste materials, we're giving them new meaning. We're giving them some form that is useful for our people. We're actually, yes, we're putting this away. So there's all sorts of things that we're doing when we're talking about land, how we work with the resources, how we upcycle resources, and how we develop our own technologies with those resources. But also, we have cultural narratives that need to shift. March 5th, 2020 was the 250th anniversary of the murder of Crispus Attucks. This is a Black and Indigenous man who was one of the first casualties of the American Revolution. You can go to Boston, you can go to the old State House, you can see a circle on the ground, and then blocks away from that, you can see the final resting place of Crispus Attucks. But what happened on that day and why it was so relevant 250 years later was that we were able to go to that site as North American Indian Center of Boston with our community partners of United American Indians in New England and New Democracy Coalition. And we came up with a list of names to read at that site. Black people, Indigenous people that were all lost to police violence within our own communities. And we tied it back to that history. We reclaimed that history. And we made ceremony out of visiting that site. Now, we had a couple dozen people join us, and that was before we realized how deep into the pandemic we were. And that was before the murder of George Floyd. This picture is actually from a march that we had called Dismantle Now, which we facilitated in July of 2020. Bringing my own context, of course, as I said in the beginning, I'm from New Orleans. I thought about the death and the end of white supremacy. I thought about how in New Orleans we have our second line parades during funeral processions. And I also thought about the needs of our elders, the needs of people with diverse abilities who were going to be marching with us on a summer day in July of 2020. So I said, instead of signs, let's have umbrellas. And we're going to paint them with all of these different messages, but we're going to provide for our community members, and we're also going to cast shade on white supremacy. And so that was my own example of bringing my own positionality, my own culture into this different local context to build solidarity with local community members across cultures, all with the common aim of dismantling white supremacy. I'm going to go ahead and just play a short clip. This is my board vice president, Mia Johnson, leading the dismantling of white supremacy. We actually took one of the umbrellas and made a monster out of it. And in each, you'll see the different pillars of white supremacy that we were dismantling that day.
And in order to endure our 500 years of genocide and to recognize that for Indigenous people, the word genocide is thought of by 87% of Indigenous people daily. So to think about that, how do you find joy? You find joy in art, in creation, and in making a way to laugh fully. So we ask you to join us as we dismantle the octopus with our Taino brothers and sisters. We are going to call out all the things that we plan and endure to tear down. We are going to tear down. I guess I should read one so you know which one I'm tearing down. Okay, brother, you gonna hold this? Hold it out. Okay, we are going to tear down capitalism. We are going to tear down colonization. We are going to tear down. This is a good one. This is a good one, my fellow brothers and sisters allies. We are going to tear down the theft of BIPOC people. This is a nice one, off the post. We will tear it down. Tear down capitalism. We're going to kill it. We will tear down. I can't see what we're tear down. We will tear down environmental racism. We are going to tear down patriarchy. I know which one that is. We'll save that. We got the last two. We got the last two because there's three. Just kidding. Okay. Yeah, that's too many. Okay, let's go. We're going to tear down exploitation. Taking bits and pieces of who we are and selling them. All right. And finally, if I could please have your help before you tear, I'm going to ask for the crowd to help us. Yep, I'm going to ask for the crowd to help us. All right, I'm going to say abolish. And you're going to say police. And I need to hear you. I need to believe you. I need to know that you are here to endure another 500 years of making sure we see our liberation. Abolish! 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 Take it down! And finally, the last thing we need to make sure, the cap that holds it all together, the thing that they have sold us as liquid gold and we know is a lie. Please help us take down white supremacy! Thank you, my brothers and sisters! We are dismantled and rebuilding the world we want to see!
It matters that a Taino woman and her son were there to do that tearing down. Also, in summer of 2020, was the beheading of the Christopher Columbus statue in so-called Christopher Columbus Waterfront Park in Boston's North End. I do have a picture of that. I actually have what happened after the fact. And we had to go back and forth. Well, first of all, we put out a press release as North American Indian Center of Boston, as United American Indians in New England. We had no idea who actually did it. So we put out the press release and we said, not it, but we're gonna go to the statue, we're gonna hold a press conference, and we're gonna say, yes, we know why this happened. You know, we don't know who did it, but we know why it happened. And that day was a bit of a mess because we were met with people that were shouting us down. There were people that were being all kinds of disruptions. And then after that fact, they did sort of the King Solomon solution of like, well, we're going to take away the statue and put that in storage, but we're going to leave the pedestal there. And what was really infuriating about that moment was that all the people that committed themselves, all of the fascists that committed themselves to actually install this monstrosity in Boston, their names still remained. So regardless of whether Christopher Columbus was there or not, the people who did that, they were still memorialized. And so as we did on every weekend before Indigenous Peoples Day in Boston, we marched. And we marched to the waterfront park. We marched to a place that had a pedestal where Christopher Columbus once stood. And in its place, we had the Taino family there. We were able to reclaim the space, and we actually had a moment where we actually took a knee for the family, for the community, for the centuries that they've had to endure just to get to this moment where we were sinking Columbus. And in October of 2021 last year, the first African-American woman mayor of Boston, Kim Janey, signed the proclamation for Indigenous Peoples Day in lieu of Christopher Columbus Day for the city of Boston. But I had some sobering realities, because I was doing a master's in design for emergent futures at the Institut d'Arquitectura Avançada de Catalunya, or the Institute of Advanced Architecture of Catalonia. And so I went to Barcelona, Spain, and I had my classmates thinking, well, my classmates proposed, like, why don't we take down the Columbus statue in Barcelona? And sure enough, like, one of my first experiences in Spain was to see this thing for myself. Now this is like, a traffic circle and a base with reliefs and a huge obelisk with Columbus pointing out towards the Mediterranean Sea, guarded by all of these lions at the base. It was just, what do you do with that? I know you have apologists, you have people that are defending like Civil War memorials here and saying, oh, we'll take it down, but like put it in a museum. It's like, how can you put this in a museum? And so this is a picture of me, because I had to go around the base. I was like, well, let me see where the indigenous peoples are. And of course, behind me, you see the relief where he finally gets there and, commits to what he has to do. But I was like, okay, I have to capture this moment. And I took that picture. And after I had that picture taken, I looked down at my feet, and there were 2 pigeons that were just eviscerated by seagulls at my feet. And I was like, okay, this is gonna take a long time. And for today, I've gotta let it go. But the fight is still gonna continue. And I'm gonna have to do my work of, my land-based work, centering my community in this space, going from being indigenous within the United States to being an immigrant in Spain, and then trying to still honor my positionality while still understanding that while we're making some headway here in the United States, the European countries have a long way to go. So the research of emergent futures, it actually started prior to me going to Spain, to signing up for the master's program itself. I actually led an Indigenous futurism class at North American Indian Center of Boston. And it was there that we started to have our own investigation into the different genres of Indigenous futurism as collected in the anthology Walking the Clouds, edited by Grace Dillon. Native slipstream, nonlinear thinking about space and time, navigating past, presents, and futures. Native apocalypse, transitioning from imbalance to balance by illustrating the trauma to provide healing. Contact, thinking of those science fiction stories of aliens and humans contacting each other. What is actually encoding? Reframing our resistance and oppression in a way that implicates that part of individuals in larger realities. Indigenous science and sustainability, which, as I said earlier, we've had that on lock for thousands of years. But also the most critical thing, returning to ourselves, Biskabiang, investigating how one is affected by colonization, discarding emotional, psychological baggage, and adapting to a post-native apocalypse world. Again, native apocalypse not meaning doomsday, but meaning that we are in a state of imbalance, and how do we transition back to a state of balance? And so I thought about that idea of post-native apocalypse curating. And in my first term in the Master's in Design, I did an intervention on a single room scale. At North American Indian Center of Boston, we have a room, a fairly dusty room with older artifacts and books and documents that we had collected over the organization's 50-year history. Of course, as a community organization, we don't really have the resources to do the level of curation that those artifacts and those documents really need. But I was able to go into that room. I talked to my executive director. I was like, look, I know this is a crazy idea. I need to have an air mattress. I'm gonna go into the dusty room, sleep there overnight, but also do some curation. By living in a 24-hour span of time with the artifacts, I was trying to form a connection with those artifacts. And I did a very limited tool set. I only had my digital camera. I had my laptop with me, of course, but I didn't even want to do Microsoft Office for spreadsheets to collect data. I was just doing text files. So I was finding my own way of making design decisions as to okay, here's a document. Where is this document from? How do I catalog this? How do I just give the credit to the tribes? I give credit to the organizations. Give credit to all of the different peoples. And so I was able to have some level of curation after that 24 time hour span. But then I went to Barcelona and I thought about how to do interventions on a citywide scale. And I believe, did we say that my family does language and culture preservation work? That's another thing that I didn't put in my bio. So my family has been doing language and culture revitalization work since at least as long as I've been alive. And so language documentation, working within archives, that's a very big thing for us. But going to Barcelona and not being confronted with Spanish, but being confronted with Catalan and understanding that there is a language barrier there, I was like, well, okay, instead of that being a roadblock, how do I then work with that barrier to actually then do more research into the local ecosystem? And so I took my camera and I went throughout the city, and everywhere I saw Catalan printed, I just took a picture of it. And what I started to find, what I started to decide was okay, this Burger King ad in the top picture, that's less helpful than the graffiti that's on the walls. That's going to tell me, yes, that's ephemeral, but that's going to start to tell me what are the needs and priorities of the local community. And so I took all of those pictures and I transcribed the text, and then I found a text-to-speech tool which took all of that text and then was able to vocalize the Catalan. And then I took all of that data and then I started to make Instagram posts on an account that I set up. And in talking with colleagues that are doing language documentation, language revitalization, but specifically for Catalan, I began to understand that there is a fear, there is a concern about the future of Catalan within the digital realm. And so by connecting with a very different space in my own way, in my own context, I was able to then act in solidarity with those local needs and priorities. And having this Instagram account, even with the few posts that I had, contributed to the overall effort of the representation of Catalan online. And so at the end of my studies in Barcelona, we received some very sad news, and that was in the end of May of last year. In Secwepemc territory, the First Nations were beginning to recover the bodies of children in unmarked graves who were lost their lives to these assimilation camps, as I've been told, but so-called residential schools. And later on, last year, Secretary Deb Haaland did come up with the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation in terms of the United States residential schools. And so it was an international concern, but I was off in Spain. But I used tools for online collaboration and convened a meeting on Zoom in which, as a community of artists, activists, designers, what can we do to put our intentions out there, to act in solidarity with First Nations? I reached out to the tribal government. I let them know that I was going to be doing these meetings, and I let them know of this idea that I had, that we were going to co-design this chimale as like an altar and as a memorial for, then it was 215, and then it quickly became 215 plus. But that was, again, me bringing my own local context into a very different space, but then cultivating solidarity in a very different way, because people that did not know so much about my own local context still wanted to be helpful. And so we had to have those conversations. We had to form those relationships and those bonds, and they had to reflect in constructing this memorial. They had to reflect on their own experiences within their own communities around education and dispossession of peoples. So before I end, we are also coming back to the United States. I started working with an organization called the Office of Uncertainty Research. And they came to us and said, we have this idea for a project in which it's called the 1 by 1 challenge. And so it could be 1 foot by 1 foot, 1 arm by 1 arm, 1 meter by 1 meter, but some square space in your local area. What can you do? What can you design? What can you build that would express your own connection to the land? And so you see on the left, you see an example from Chalianaru, who was talking about her own way of connecting with the land through walks, her daily walks. And so you see different artifacts from the land that she walks. You see dirt, the bowl shape that's holding up the feather and the rocks and the frogs. That's actually a mold of her hands. And you can see like some of her own sort of visual language at the bottom of this piece. On the right-hand side, you see a design from Julia Galvez, who wanted to place a piece by her grandmother's grave that would actually catch rose petals from flowers that were placed there and hold them in a pool of water because her grandmother's name is Rose. And so, yes, we're thinking about land, we're thinking about animals, we're thinking about everything that's there, but we also think about who is buried underneath all this land that holds us, that sustains us. This is the purpose of land acknowledgements, is to understand that when you are walking this land, you're walking the trails that people have walked before for millennia, but you're also walking land in which their ancestors are buried. And we hold those connections, we keep those connections, even through these very, designy type of things, using digital technologies. Doesn't matter the tool. All that matters really is the relationships and the connections. And so here, finally, is the vision. And in order for you to understand this, I'm going to use my last minute here, and I'm going to tell you the story of how I got to this vision statement. So, Taioronaka, Tunica people, came from a sacred mountain, Timaranha, from an opening in that sacred mountain. Guarding that sacred opening rest two alligators, Tunica-Biloxi and Tunica-Biloxi, the red alligator and the blue alligator. When the red alligator would roll up and show its belly, the weather would be warmer for longer. When the blue alligator would roll and show its belly, the weather would be cooler for longer. Tuaka, our sub-commander, would tell our people to go to this mount once or twice a year. And before we go, we would have to fast. And if we did not fast, then either the red alligator or the blue alligator would eat us, swallow us whole. We actually know where Timaranha is. And for my grandmother's tribe, the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, we know where Naniwaya is. We can go to the very specific points, to very specific lands, where our people emerged from the earth. And so thinking about that specificity and thinking about that positionality, regardless of where we are in space, talking about just land, I'm not talking, well, even the universe perhaps, because there are some people, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, that got some colonial designs on space, so yeah. So yeah, in space, as long as we understand where we are from specifically, understanding those origins where we are in space, and then thinking about time, thinking about sustaining balance as future ancestors, because we're not always going to be young forever, and there will be generations that come behind us that will refer to us as ancestors. And so how do we then sustain balance, being who we are, where we're from, in the spaces that we are now? And how do we build that story together? This is a vision, and I thank you for letting me share this time with you all. Tikach.